Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for taking time out of your day to join SQFI for today's webinar. My name is Sarah Milenich. I'm the Director of Sales and Marketing here at SQFI, and I will be your host for today's webinar. Today's webinar, which is How to Successfully Manage Facility Visitors, is presented by Christina Astorga, the President and Owner of Food Safety and Quality Systems, and is sponsored by Magnifa Group. However, before we get started with the presentation, I'd like to take a moment to go over our webinar protocol. First, I would like to remind you that this webinar is being recorded. It will take us a few business days to process this recording, but you should find it on both our YouTube channel and our events page of our website by this Friday, which is September 15th. Second, if you have any questions for the speakers during their presentation, please feel free to write them into the chat box that's located on the right-hand side of the screen. We will be copying these over to the presenters as they come in, and they will answer them at the end of the presentation during our Q&A period. Also, before we get started, I would like to take a moment to go over some SQFI happenings. Just as a reminder, we have a FSMA resource page. We know that the rules and implementation of the Food Safety Modernization Act are in everyone's minds, and sorting through the FDA FSMA rules can be a time-consuming and confusing task. So we've put together a FSMA resource page to help you understand the legal and regulatory complexities of FSMA while alleviating some pain points our stakeholders are struggling with regarding implementation and execution. Just want to point out, in addition to the comparisons the Atchison Group did for SQFI of the preventive control for human food and produce safety rules to the elements of our SQF Level 2, we encourage you to visit the page to use the preventive controls and produce safety audit checklists and guidance documents we've created for stakeholders to use as a guide for identifying the necessary steps to bridge any gaps between a company's SQF program and the PC and produce safety rules. It's important to note, however, that using these documents does not guarantee FSMA compliance, nor does it absolve the supplier from ensuring that they meet all aspects of the FSMA preventive controls or produce safety rules. This checklist is voluntary. It will not be scored, but it's a valuable tool to help you, the suppliers, identify and understand any differences between the SQF program and the FSMA rules. You can also talk to your certification body about using these checklists and guidance documents as well. We are in our Information Day season. We have 2 Information Days remaining for the year of 2017. Next week, we are holding our Canadian Information Day in Guelph, and in November, we are again joining forces with the Food Safety Consortium and holding our Information Day prior to the opening of the conference. The SQF Information Day is a day-long, face-to-face informational seminar that's designed to introduce food suppliers at all levels of the food chain to the benefits of food safety and quality certification. Information Day attendees will leave with new insights, connections, and a clear understanding of how they can implement a food safety and quality program that best fits the needs of their business and the needs of their customers. I'm always looking for sponsors for our Information Days, so if you're interested in sponsoring one of these events, please feel free to email or call me. Hopefully you've noticed, starting in January, that we have changed the way we communicate with our stakeholders. Instead of sending multiple emails each month advertising individual events and updates, we now use a monthly e-newsletter to communicate these things with our stakeholders. The goal of the newsletter is to reduce the amount of emails we send to our stakeholders and facilitate more of a thought leadership role in the food safety, quality, and ethical sourcing industries, truly facilitating a safer world and smarter you. Our newsletter keeps you up to speed on new events, videos, supplier spotlights, and the latest food safety, quality, and ethical sourcing news, while providing opportunities for you to get involved in our many initiatives and trainings. Additionally, it allows us to consolidate all of our messaging into one monthly e-blast so we don't overwhelm your inboxes. It's free, it's open, and anyone is welcome to receive it. Coming up very shortly, Robert Garfield, Leanne Chuboff, and Bill McBride will be doing their supplier seminar series in Japan, Taiwan, and Australia. They'll be conducting a series of seminars on the changes to the SQF program and discuss how SQF certification will assist in these areas, U.S. FDA foreign supplier verification requirements. We have a handful of trainings left for this year, in addition to the pre-conference training that we are doing at our conference, which will be on another slide. But as you can see, we're well on the way to training our stakeholders on the new Edition 8 quality codes, as well as doing another lead auditor and auditing SQF systems training, as well as a professional update, which is in the middle of December. So we are 12 to about 7 weeks out from our conference. We are very excited about it here internally, getting our word out. The numbers are growing. Attendance is fabulous. Our exhibit area is sold out with our sponsors and exhibitors, and just want to make sure that you are aware that our conference is coming. We're almost actually sold out of our room block. I think we're about 80% sold out of the hotel room block. So make sure you sign up for our conference and get your room registrations in. This is going to be a great event. We have a number of fabulous pre-conference training courses that happen on the Sunday and Monday before the conference starts. You can find more information about our conference and all the great things we're doing at sqfconference.com, or email us if you have any questions. And finally, before I introduce our sponsor, just take a minute to let you know where we're going to be out and about the next month or two, as well as our contact information for any inquiries you might have regarding our customer service, our marketing and sales program, our database, and compliance and technical aspects. So with no further ado, I'd like to pass the mic over to Andrew Wolf, who's from Magnific Group, and he is our sponsor for the day. So take it away, Andrew.
Hi, good afternoon or good morning, depending where you are in the country, to everybody. Thank you for participating in today's Learning Lunch. My name is Andrew Wolpe. I'm the president of Magnific Group, and we are the developer of AccessWise, which you see on the screen here. I just want to thank Sarah, Leanne, Leslie, and the rest of the team at SQF, one for recognizing the value of AccessWise, as I'll go through now, and also giving us this opportunity to sponsor the presentation. Right after I'm done, Christina will get into more detail on how to successfully manage facility visitors. What I'm going to do is give you a quick overview of our solution, AccessWise, which is web-based and actually helps to do exactly that, successfully manage facility visitors. The primary purpose, of course, of managing that aspect is to prevent unlawful access and then ultimately prevent intentional food supply contamination. So the print on the screen may be a little bit small. I apologize. It's the transition between PowerPoint and WebEx. The concept of controlling access to a facility with software is not actually new. We work heavily in the medical industry, where hospitals have been doing this for about 7 years, where people have to actually show specific credentials before getting into the hospital. We've developed AccessWise, though, specifically for the food industry. What does that mean? It enables you to be in compliance with both the FSMA Food Defense Plan as well as some of the new SQF Edition 8 requirements. On here you can see a few, Section 2.33, the management of contract service provider documents, training for employees, which is Section 2.9, a big section. Also training for contractors and for visitors. Point 3 there, facility access control at the point of entry and exit. And then actual providing data, real-time data on activity, which is extremely useful in the event of evacuations or audits. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on each of those points. The first part, contract service provider document management. Really the idea is to take it from a paper process to a paperless process, so eliminating the overload of paper. The system, access-wise, literally removes any need to have paper. It allows you to, one, receive requests from new contract service providers, to then go in and review and or approve those documents. And once that's in place, you'll have an automated system with reminders where both you and this contract service provider will be notified if any documents are coming out of compliance or are expiring. So that's the first part of the system. The second part is the training component. With the training, really focusing on Section 2.9 of the SQF code of the Edition 8, it's not only for employees, as I mentioned earlier, but also for contractors and visitors. Access-wise, one will online, it will host the content, it will deliver the training, and then it'll allow you to monitor it as well. So at any time, you'll be able to see who's been trained and what they've been trained on. Most importantly, you'll be able to get this information before people are actually performing their work activities. So this is a real-time information that's delivered to you. You can then inject yourself into the process and prevent people from continuing from their activities by ensuring that they continue their training or complete their training beforehand. The system also provides real-time activity reports. So again, I mentioned at any time you'll be able to see who's been trained and what they've been trained on. These, of course, can also be used for audits, both internal and external audits. At the point of entry, so this is kind of the real crux of the system, if you will, controlling the access to your facility. The system will verify, as you can see in the first image, people will sign in, and right there the system will verify that anyone who's coming in, whether it's a visitor, whether it's an employee, whether it's a contract service provider, a temporary employee, that they have the necessary documentation, certifications, training, licenses in place before they can get into the facility. This verification is done within AccessWise. Assuming everything is appropriate and verified, the system will also allow for the automatic generation of a badge. This badge will be color-coded, thereby allowing you to control where people go within the facility. So very important, especially in terms of I don't have the exact section, but the ability to actually control contractors and visitors within your facility. Oh, clicked the wrong button, excuse me. Any activity within your facility, AccessWise will track, so you'll be able to see who's come in, who's gone out, when they came in, when they came out, which company they were with, whether it's internal employee, temporary, or even someone simply coming in as a visitor to do a sales call. In terms of crisis management, in the event of an evacuation, you'll have access to real-time data, so you'll know at any point of time who's in the facility. And then also, again, in terms of an audit, you'll have the historical data of visits in and out of your facility. So as a company and being in this industry, we're extremely excited about the value that AccessWise can bring to your facilities. We're planning regional rollouts of the system in early 2018. So please, you have information up here. In fact, this presentation was forwarded to you with the last email from SQF. And we'll also have questions and answers at the end of the session. We are exhibiting at the SQF conference as well, so we will be there, so please visit us there. So what I'll do now is I will turn this over to Christina, so she can then continue with her presentation. Thank you, everybody.
Hello, folks. Sarah, I don't believe I have control of the slides yet.
Hi, Christina. You should have that. Can you try moving them forward one?
Yep, not going.
Okay.
Wouldn't you know it, folks? We tested all this before you got on the line, and now it doesn't work. It's kind of like things going wrong when the auditor's standing there. Everything will work 364 days out of the year, but the minute the auditor's standing next to you, there.
Okay. Hang on. I just transferred it back to me and then back to you. Now let's see if it's still stuck.
Nope. Nada.
Nothing. Okay. Well, that's okay. You can just tell me when you want me to move the slide forward. You can just say next slide, and then I will do that for you. You
got it. No problem. All right, so I guess we're going to start with the thank you again. Thank you, Andrew, for the presentation regarding AccessWise. As Andrew mentioned, my name is Christina Kelly Astorga. I am the president and one of the owners of Food Safety and Quality Systems, LLC. We are a licensed and accredited training center located in the Chicago area. We are one of the first, I would say, probably first 2 or 3 licensed training centers that was providing SQF practitioner training in the United States when the GFSI criteria began rolling out here in the U.S. I would also like to add my thanks to Leslie, Leanne, Sarah, and the SQF Institute for being such great vendor partners with us and allowing us the time to talk to you about how to successfully manage your facility visitor access and introduce AccessWise, a solution to those requirements. This webinar is intending to focus on the importance of implementing your SQF contract service approval requirements and to help you meet the requirements of the Edition 8 SQF code and your food security or food defense regulations within your operation. So before we get too far into this, I want you to imagine a time where you have been in the middle of some type of an audit, whether it was an internal audit, external audit with either a customer or maybe even a third party, maybe SQF or a different auditor before then. You get ready to hand over your pest control manual to the auditor for them to review that section, and as you open the book, you realize that your license for that pest control operator expired yesterday. We've all, most of us, I would say, have probably been in a similar situation where a document that we thought was valid and current expired very recently right before an auditor came in the door, and of course we receive a nonconformance for that, as we should, because our documentation is not the way that it should be. That is a very frustrating experience, especially considering when you operate in a very large producing facility that's got sometimes dozens, if not hundred, contract service providers that provide those services, and on top of that, they in turn provide, a dozen different documents or records that have got to be maintained. All of these records do expire at different time frames, so it's not like we can say once a year we go after this stuff and we're able to keep the most current copies on file. When Magnifi approached me last year in our Food Safety Training Center with a possible solution being AccessWise, a solution to this problem, I was amazed. I was like, that is so simple. I wish we had had something like that when I was in a producing facility. I am very, very excited about this product and very glad to be able to show you how it actually meets the requirements of SQF as well as our regulations. Okay, Sarah, next one. All right, very good. So the presentation today is going to cover 4 main topics within the code. They include our approved supplier program for contract services, food security and food defense requirements for facility access, the training expectations for visitors, contract service providers, and the minimum expectations for employees prior to gaining entry to our processing areas. The training, and then also lastly, how do we manage those records, both the training records as well as the approved supplier records for our service providers? Next slide. Learning objectives for this webinar. Following the webinar, participants will be able to understand the requirements for a site's approved supplier program for contract services, understand what is risk level for contract services and how is it determined. That was a new kind of concept that was introduced by SQF when GFSI started rolling out in the United States. We're very familiar with understanding how to do risk assessments for raw materials, but we've never really applied that principle to our contract services. So how do we do that? How is contract service approval criteria for SQF related to FSMA? How do we determine who is supposed to be included on our contract service specification register? What does that look like? What does it mean to control access to the premises by contractors and visitors, and what kind of options do we have? What training is required for visitors, and how are the requirements different from contract service providers, and also, quite honestly, how are they also different from employees? Although there are similarities across all three categories, there are significant differences as well. And then what additional training may be required for any maintenance or engineering contractors that will be providing services within our processing facility or on our site? Okay, very good. Next slide. So first topic, approved supplier for contract services. Next slide, please. So section 2.4.4.3 of the SQF code states that the responsibility and procedure for selecting, evaluating, approving, monitoring approved supplier shall be documented and implemented. The approved supplier program shall be based on the prior performance and the risk level of the raw material ingredients, packaging materials, and the services supplied, and shall contain as a minimum the agreed upon specifications, the reference to the level of risk applied to the raw material ingredient, packaging materials, and the services. So let's just take a second and break this apart. A key to implementing elements of the SQF code, as well as any other standard for that matter, is to begin to understand how to read the sometimes very wordy language that's used. So what exactly does it mean when it says the responsibility shall be documented? Well, anywhere it says responsibility, we want to see who is responsible for that particular program by job title. The job title should be listed as the responsible entity within the procedure itself. How this ties to our approval process, that individual may be the one that has the sign-off or the green light on all of the documents that come through to approve that vendor to be authorized to be on our site. When the standard says we need to outline the methods, when it states we need to define or we need to document something, what your auditor is looking for is an actual written procedure of some kind. Be very careful to pay attention to the written language in the code. Not every element of the code requires a written procedure. Only in sections where it specifically tells you you must outline the methods, define, or document the process. Now, I also believe that one of the greatest benefits about the SQF program is that it's not prescriptive. There's nothing here that tells you what is the correct format that you must follow to document that process. Documented procedures can look very different from one facility to another, and all of them can be perfectly adequate. Many companies take the approach of writing a written procedure that includes different sections such as purpose, scope, responsibility, references, and then provides the method of how that procedure is followed. Others may simply document the process utilizing a flow chart, a decision tree, or a business flow map. Any of these formats can be acceptable as long as it addresses the key elements that are outlined within the code. In this case, 2.4.4.3 requires that we define the methods of how we select the vendor. So what does that mean? Is it simply based on price? do we gather multiple proposals and just use the least costly? Well, yeah, sometimes that does happen. It's going to really be dependent upon the contract service or the material that you need to get approved to be bringing into your facility. How do we evaluate their ability to perform a task? Because the second portion of that says we have to evaluate this service. Is this a service that may require multiple backups to ensure that my service is performed at the required frequency? An example might be your pest control company. I might take several proposals, and the least cost provider may be who I want to choose. But if that pest control company only has a single service technician that is authorized to do commercial application of pesticides in a food manufacturing or food services facility, then that may not be the choice for me because they really don't have the resources that I need. How do you actually approve the vendor? The most common practice is to simply submit a request to that vendor for all of the required documentation necessary for approval. And someone within your organization then is responsible for evaluating and reviewing those records to make sure that they are current and that they meet any company code or regulatory minimum guidelines. An example might be, I need a liability insurance certificate, and our company has a company policy with a $10 million minimum expectation. So in reviewing that record, I would be looking for the date of expiration to make sure that it's current and it's valid, and I would be looking for the minimum criteria set forth by my own organization as the standard. The approved supplier program shall also be based on the prior performance and risk level of the raw material ingredients, packaging materials, and the services supplied. The first part of that sentence is fairly easily understood and straightforward. We've been doing risk assessments on raw materials for more than 50 years. The risk assessment of the raw material ingredients, packaging materials, and processing aids are included as a part of our HACCP plan, or under today's law, could be included as part of your preventive controls food safety plan. The second portion of that statement, however, was new to our industry when GFSI and the SQF code was introduced into the U.S. And it is one that is commonly misunderstood. What is a risk assessment for a supplier that provides services, and how do I do that? So we're going to address that question in the upcoming slides. Sarah? So what is the definition of an approved supplier? Well, if you look at the SQF code, edition 8, on page 117 under the manufacturing code, they have outlined an approved supplier as being a supplier that has been assessed and approved by a site based on risk assessment as capable of meeting the site's food safety and quality requirements for goods and services supplied. Okay, still a little vague. So I looked it up to see what Webster said about it. Webster says that a contract for services is a contract in which a provider of services agrees to provide a service to a client in exchange for payment. Now, that's where it starts to get a little fuzzy, and it starts to not be as clear to many sites about, well, where does this person really fit? Are they a provider of a material? Are they a service supplier? Or are they a visitor when they come into my plant? Well, to be honest, it's actually very possible that they can be all three. So an example here might be, if I have a chemical supplier who is providing me with cleaning chemicals and sanitizers that are going to be utilized for cleaning my food processing equipment in the environment, they are an approved supplier for the material. That chemical supplier can also, however, be a contract service provider. It depends on what other services they're providing in the act of giving you those chemicals. If your chemical supplier is responsible for coming on site and performing titrations, strip testing, or other types of inspection to ensure that the concentration of that solution is being maintained within the acceptable range, they are both a vendor for materials as well as a contract service provider. That chemical manufacturer may be the one that comes in and provides calibration or verification of calibration of your metering of your dosing system. They may be the ones that actually perform the preventative maintenance on the lines or on the valves to ensure that they maintain in proper working order. At that point, that chemical supplier now becomes a contract service provider as well. Another example may be packaging suppliers. Suppliers that provide film or overwrap or the container that the product goes into. But many of these packaging companies not only provide you with the material, but they also employ packaging engineers that have the ability to come out to a site or to a facility and help you with a new product startup or a new line startup, or maybe just to troubleshoot problems that you're having that you are struggling with in your everyday running. In this example, the vendor of the material is both an approved supplier for the material as well as an approved supplier for contract services. So in plain English terms, what that means is this vendor needs to be on both registers. They need to be on your approved supplier register for materials and ultimately on your contract service specification register as well. Next slide. So who exactly is supposed to be on that register? Well, many duties within the food production or processing facility can be conducted by individuals or organizations that are not employed by the business, but are contracted to provide very specialist services. A common misunderstanding or misconception is that contract service providers only require approval and submission or admission onto the register if they are services on site and within my operation. And that misconception or misunderstanding is inaccurate. Contract service providers can be on-site, such as contract sanitation or temporary labor. They can be off-site, such as a third-party laboratory that you send water samples or air samples or environmental samples out to. Contractors, some of them need access to the entire facility, such as a pest control operator. They're going to need inside, outside, throughout your main processing areas where we have exposed food, but they also need access to our storage areas, our auxiliary areas, in some cases areas that nobody else goes into. Some contract service providers never get outside of our office area. I could have an IT contractor who comes in who simply works in the office areas and on my servers and never sets foot actually out into production. They're still a contract service provider. And some of our service providers actually never even come into the building at all. Examples of this would be individuals that are responsible for landscaping or snow removal within our organization. Contract service providers can include transport, such as long-haul carriers, LTL, or any other transport that is arranged by you, the shipper. If it's a CPU or a customer pickup, that would be a contract service provider for the customer who is arranging the transport. They can include construction or engineering services, temporary labor, sanitation, chemical management that we've already spoke about, trash collection. Trash collection can actually be even split down farther. You may have contract service providers that haul off your normal solid waste to take it to landfill. You may have a different service provider that is responsible for removal of bloodborne pathogen materials or of parts cleaner or other types of items that we cannot dispose of through our normal disposal practices. You could have a waste management company that's responsible for destruction of trademark materials. If you're sending printed cartons or film to someone to have them incinerated or shredded or destroyed in some format and providing you with a certificate of destruction to ensure that those materials don't make it out into the marketplace, that would be an example of a contract service provider. The contract service itself does not need to directly involve product safety or quality, but it still could indirectly affect the product or the facility. An example here would be if I have a maintenance contractor or an engineer that is working on a building expansion in a portion of my building, and in that area they've brought in gang boxes and lips and equipment into that facility. If that equipment is not inspected prior to bringing it into my plant and prior to use within my plant, how do I know that he's not bringing in something that came out of another facility, maybe an allergen or a biological hazard that's not normally present in my facility? It comes in with the tools and equipment that the contractors are bringing in. I could have people traffic, pallet traffic, product flow that crosses over areas where these contractors have been, and at that point I'm then tracking those potential contaminants throughout my own processing facility. The auditor is going to seek evidence of existence of your specification register. They want to see the list, and they are going to choose so many contractors off that list and say, okay, let me see the approval records that you required to authorize this particular vendor. So they'll look at a sampling of those specifications and of the records, and they'll also look at their training requirements, the qualifications and credentials of the contract staff. In other words, how are they trained to provide the service? If I have a pest control operator coming into my facility to provide pest control services, I'm not training that pest control operator on which chemicals to use. He should already be trained. In a case where that service requires a license, evidence of training is pretty easy. Give me a copy of your license, and every year when it expires and you have to renew it, you have to give me a new copy. There are a lot of services, however, that we bring into our facility that don't require licensing, but we still have an obligation as a food processor in choosing that service to understand what is the expectation for you training your employees on how to perform that task for me. I am paying you to be able to adequately provide that service. So all of these things would be examples of what an auditor would be looking for. Next slide. There are certain rights and responsibilities for both the service provider as well as the receiver of the service. As far as the service provider is concerned, they have the responsibility to work carefully and to work safely, to stay within the required areas that you've given access to, and to follow your safety protocols as well as those that are defined within their own industry. They have the responsibility to act in the client's best interest, to ensure that the service that is being provided meets the expectation. We want to make sure that the work is performed on time and in keeping with the contract. On time for us can be very critical. If we have a pest control contract and a pest control procedure that requires that we have monitoring of pest activity on a weekly basis, weekly means something. And you know that our auditors are going to say, well, what does weekly mean? Does that mean every 7 days? Does that mean once within a week time period? Exactly what does that mean? And then they'll review our service reports and look at the dates in between services to ensure that whatever the contract stated, we followed exactly. The service provider is required to follow the rules, standards, and guidelines that are in his or her field. These are commonly called rules of art or good practices or best practices within that industry. And they are for sure required to follow the rules, standards, and guidelines for accessing a food or a food packaging manufacturing site. These are our GMPs. And then lastly, they have to provide us with records. Records have got to be legible, they've got to be accurate, they've got to include dates of completion of the service as well as the name or initials of the person providing that task. If the service requires a license, it may require the license numbers to be included on those service reports. But the long and the short of it is the service records really become our evidence of compliance. And so the contractor must understand that records have got to be complete and accurate. Next slide. We as the site have certain rights and responsibilities as well. The manufacturing site receiving the services shall ensure that we have an approval of the contract service provider, that we understand the risks to the site and the product that may be introduced or controlled by the service. We need to set the expectation we are responsible for setting the specification or the scope of work. Just as with raw and packaging materials, specifications must be defined for contract services, and they have to be in place for all providers. The specification may include the contract and will describe fully the services provided and how the safety and the quality of the product are protected from the actions and presence of the contract personnel. This will include, as necessary, qualifications of contract personnel, the equipment, tools, and chemicals that are permitted on site. Contractors working within our facility will be subject to the same personal hygiene and welfare conditions as employees. This information should also be included in your contract service specification. Specification must include the training required by the training provider or by the service provider. Training could be done by the service provider. They can be provided by you in some circumstances, or it could be by certification or licensing, as we've already discussed. All current specifications for contract service providers must be included in that contract service register. Next slide. So here's a big one. What is risk level for contract services and how is it determined? The first question I often get is, why do we even need a risk assessment of our contract services? Well, many times we just don't think about our service providers as being a point of potential introduction of contaminants within our operation, but they actually can play a very, very large role in the safety of our products and of our employees. So a scenario may be, I have a uniform service who picks up my uniforms and cleans them. I am a high-risk process with a high moisture activity product that would allow for microbial growth. Would it be a problem if my uniform company came in and picked up my uniforms and my frocks, took them out to the truck, threw them in the truck, went down the road to a local Jiffy Lube and picked up their mechanic uniforms and threw them into the same containers within the truck? That would be an issue. When those uniforms are cleaned, they are meant to remove certain types of soils that are present based on where those uniforms or frocks came from. If we're throwing in mechanic uniforms used in an auto body place or in an auto repair facility into the same containments that are holding frocks used in a food processing facility, the soils are not the same. The washing process may not be the same. The chemicals used to remove soils wouldn't be the same. And the last time I checked, I don't know of too many food-grade greases that are used on a Honda. So our service providers really can have an indirect but significant impact to the safety of the products that we produce. Things to consider when determining risk level for a contract service: where's the contractor going to be working? Do they need access to my facility at all? Are they simply outside, or do they come in the building? If they are coming in the building, where in the building do they need to go? If they need access to my processing areas where I have open food, do I have other risks to consider? Am I a raw and fully cooked facility? If I am, how does that service provider have to provide service? There's a flow that they have to follow to ensure the safety of my products. I don't want them providing services in my raw areas and then going across into my fully cooked areas and providing services over there. It needs to be the opposite. Will the service that they are providing require chemicals? If so, we need records. We need to know, what are you bringing on site? What are you using? How do you dispose of it? Are you taking it with you, or are you throwing it away in my garbage? We may need to have chemical approval records, being our MSDS or SDS in today's language, maybe a technical data sheet that goes along with that, some other evidence that this particular chemical that you're bringing into my plant that produces food, that chemical is allowed for use within this organization. Can the service that they are providing impact a CCP or a CQP? If I have somebody who's coming in to calibrate scales, How did that person get trained to calibrate scales? If those scales are being used for in-process checks and not properly calibrated, it may result in my product being out of specification for quality. If those scales, however, are being utilized to confirm or verify net weight compliance, if that technician is not fully trained on how to properly calibrate that scale, it could result in regulatory infractions for me. Can the results of the service dramatically impact my response? An example here would be someone that is utilizing a third-party laboratory to provide pathogen test results for Zone 1 testing. If we're doing food contact surface testing and we need to wait until those test results are returned to us, essentially our product is on hold. It can't be shipped until those results are provided back and show that that product is clean and it's free for shipment. If I have a laboratory that has limited resources, limited personnel, or doesn't have a turnaround time of at least 3 days, if it's going to take me 5 days to get those test results back, that hamstrings my shipments. It holds up my inventory, may possibly short a load or short deliver to a customer. So certain services provide high risk, some services provide a moderate risk, and others provide a low risk. And understanding the risk to those services helps us determine what service provider that we should choose, as well as the types of approval records that we need to have in place to authorize them to be an approved supplier. Next slide. So once we've approved the contract service provider, what training are they required to have? And how does that differ between a visitor, a contract service provider, and an employee? Next slide. Training requirements for visitors. Section 11.3.5.5 states that all visitors shall be trained in the facility's food safety and hygiene procedures before entering into any food processing or handling areas, or shall be escorted at all times in food processing, handling, and storage areas. So what's the minimum expectation? For visitors, we want to make sure that they are trained on our personnel or personal GMPs. Personnel GMPs may include what type of PPE we have to have in that organization. Is it a hairnet? Is it a beard net? If so, what's the proper way to wear that? Is it on the bridge of the nose? Is it underneath the nose? Is it covering only a beard guard that covers hair below the lip line? Do we require earplugs, shoe covers, captive shoes? Visitors should be instructed on proper hand washing. All visitors must have clean hands upon entering the processing area. Removal of jewelry in accordance with our GMPs. No loose items or personal items that can fall off or get into product. We want to tell them, don't touch anything. You're a visitor in our operation. You're not here to work on anything. You're here to observe and to possibly interview others, but don't touch anything. Don't touch ingredients. Don't touch our product. Don't touch our equipment. And make sure that you stay with your escort at all times. We have very, very limited training that is required for visitors because the expectation is that if I'm going to be escorted by company personnel, in the event of a crisis, of an evacuation, or if something goes wrong, I have that management individual that is there to provide direction to that visitor. Now, there may certainly be other policies that are applicable here that are dependent upon your organization. Most food companies or food plants today are going to ask that you also sign a non-disclosure agreement or some type of a confidentiality or proprietary information statement before coming into my facility. Certain facilities that have got significant human safety concerns, such as plants that utilize ammonia for refrigeration, may include as a part of their visitor training requirements or evacuation routes or meeting points in the event that we have an evacuation. But visitor training requirements are pretty minimal, mainly because the expectation is that they're going to be escorted by a company representative who will ensure that that visitor doesn't do something that they're not supposed to do. Next slide. So what are the training requirements? for contract service providers? Well, all contract service providers entering processing are visitors, but not all visitors are contract service providers. That being said, contract service providers are subject to all of the requirements on the previous slide because they are a visitor. The contract service providers require more training. It's going to be obviously dependent upon where they're going and what they're doing, but things to consider would be waste removal. We don't want contractors throwing trash, empty chemical containers, used parts, tools, debris, things like that in edible bins, for example. We don't want you to use our product boxes to put trash in. We don't want you to use anything that's not identified for that purpose. So we may have to be the ones that tell the contractor, look, this is the appropriate way to properly dispose of waste that is coming from the service that you're giving us. All contractors entering my facility need to understand you cannot bring glass in here. We have a no glass policy. If you have equipment, if you have tools or utensils that have glass components to it, you need to get them approved by management prior to bringing them in the operation, because there may be other expectations that we have around how you handle that glass instrument or that glass equipment. What kinds of chemicals are you bringing in, and what is that usage? We've already kind of discussed that, but it does come down to, is that chemical approved for use in here? Now, for contractors like pest control services, that one's pretty, again, straightforward for us. But if you're bringing in a maintenance contractor or an engineering contractor that's doing a very large construction project, that list of chemicals that they are going to be utilizing can be quite lengthy and not be approved for use in a food plant. So it would have to be used in segregated areas that are under construction and that are maintained away from the rest of our product flow and our flow until those areas can be cleaned and inspected and released for operation. Contractors may need to understand our product or our process protection requirements. In other words, if you are going to be installing new communication lines, routers or phone lines through the storage area, and you're going to be working directly above where my racking is, and I have raw materials or finished products in that area, I may need to move them. I may need to pull the things out of those racks and provide you with a clean area underneath it. That way, any work that you do above it doesn't cause contaminants to fall down onto my product. We may need to understand what access points they have. We try very hard to route visitors, contractors, and to some extent employees through designated access points so we can control facility access, so we can control GMPs. But depending on the service provider and where they need access within your facility, say, for example, you've got a contractor that's doing construction work on the back of the building and needs access to a man door that is generally locked out and has no outside door handle. We may have emergency crash bar on the inside, but that contractor really needs to be bringing in materials or supplies in through that particular door. We're going to do that. Can't prop that door open for any extended period of time, but it's a risk that we would have to consider, and how are we going to manage that? And we do have restricted access areas. Some food plants have got such highly controlled or regulated areas, plants that produce baby food, that produce materials or food products that are intended for nursing homes or for hospitals, are going to have higher, stricter requirements as far as micro is concerned for how it gets tracked through our facility. So there may be areas that we just don't want that contractor in. And again, you may have company policies that are applicable here as well. So there are some services that we require, such as pest control, that service provider must report to us upon entry to the facility. That is so we can communicate with them any findings or any issues that we have been informed of since their last visit. And they're required to report to you upon completion of the service, a follow-up. I'm done, this is what I found, this is the corrective actions that we took based on any findings that you gave us. and here are the service reports that reflect all of the information from today's service. So there can be many, many other company policies here that would be applicable to a contract service provider that a visitor may not necessarily have to be trained on. Next slide. For contractors such as maintenance or engineering contractors, the food safety fundamental sections of the code specifically call out maintenance and engineering contractors are required to have prior notification of that service prior to completing the repair. They have to report to a responsible individual. We have to schedule those repairs outside of normal processing times. Or again, we have to cover or remove product or equipment that would be directly below where that service is to be performed. Maintenance and engineering contractors are responsible for the removal of parts, tools, and debris upon completion of a repair. They're the only ones that really know what was utilized during that service. And if it's possible that parts or debris got down into a different area or section of the equipment that we may now need to disassemble and or clean and inspect prior to resuming operations. And lastly, we do need to inspect that area. It always amazes me how folks don't go out and inspect a service after a maintenance contractor has been in your building. I have a client who recently said to me, Christina, it would be no different than if I brought a contractor into my house to do a building expansion. If I'm going to do an addition or a room add-on in my home, I'm going to go out there every day. I want to check on the progress. I want to know, what problems are you encountering, if everything's on schedule and on track, and then upon completion of that service, I am for sure going to inspect the work to make sure it's done to my satisfaction. You may have, again, additional company policies related to your maintenance or your engineering contractors, things like lockout, tagout, hot work permits, confined space requirements, those things that would be very important to EHS. You may have very specific company policies about parts and tool usage. Either you can bring your own and we will inspect them before you use them, or you can use ours and you can't bring anything on this facility or on this grounds or in this site. So we'll provide you with what you need. Just give us a list. So company policies as applicable here need to be reviewed as well as it relates to your maintenance and engineering tasks. Next slide. Training requirements for employees. Now, obviously, training requirements for employees can be very, very lengthy. All we have included in this slide for the purpose of this presentation is the bare bone minimum expectation of what an employee would need to know before they set foot into your production or your processing areas. They would be required to be trained on food safety and food hygiene practices as outlined in our personnel GMPs. We have a mandatory expectation that our management commitment to product safety is understood. That's part of your policy statement. Every person that sets foot into your facility, visitor, contractor, or employee, needs to understand that food safety is a priority to us. If you see something, you must say something. That you, as our employee, our contractor, or our visitor, have an obligation to tell us what's wrong so we can fix it, so we can take initiative to be able to take corrective action. We want to make sure that that employee and or that contractor knows who they report to. That's part of your organizational chart reporting requirements. The code specifically calls out that you shall have an organizational chart and it shall be effectively communicated to all. This is your supervisor. This is your lead. If any problems, come to this person. If you can't find this person or if they can't resolve your problem, then their boss is so-and-so. So who do you report to and who do you go to when you have a problem? Under the new preventive control requirements, as well as under Edition 7.2 of the code, we've had a mandatory requirement for allergen awareness. If we produce products in our facilities that contain any of the 8 major allergens in the United States, we have to inform our employees about the types of allergens where they could come in contact with them, and what our controls are, whether it's through color coding, through sanitation practices, through segregation. All of that must be included. In section 11.4, it specifically calls out employees shall be informed of the company's policy relating to bait stations and pest prevention activities. Employees need to be informed about keep doors closed. Make sure that you're not propping things open. That if you see pests, you have to report that to your immediate supervisor, again, so we can take corrective actions. And again, there may be additional company policies as applicable that you yourself consider to be the minimum expectation that an employee would have to go through before setting foot out into that processing area. Next slide. So our vendors have been approved. Everyone's been trained. Now how do we get into the plant? Next slide. So how does all of this tie together to our food security, food defense, or food fraud requirements? Well, there are three specific portions of the code that would tie to that. 2712 talks about we must have the ability to record and control access to the premises by contractors and visitors. Now, there's lots of ways to meet this expectation. Some companies utilize camera systems, others use visitor logs at the desk coming into the facility. Those both would be examples of how you could record access. Controlling access, however, is a little different. Controlling access indicates that we've got locked doors or that it's going to be difficult for them to get into different areas of the facility without an escort, without some kind of a key code entry, or without some other way to be able to ensure that they can only get into areas that the control has been authorized. Second bullet point there, we have to define the methods. Methods means how. You have to tell me how we are going to ensure that only authorized personnel have access to these areas. So that, again, ties back to the control. This is one of my favorite parts of AccessWise. Once a contract service provider has given me all their documentation, they've given me their spec, they've given me their license, they've given me their insurance or whatever else that I've asked for, if that license expires today, tomorrow when that vendor shows up at my door and tries to get in, he will not be able to gain access because his records are not current. That, to me, is awesome. The last bullet point, food supplied shall comply with legislation. This goes back to section 2.4.1 of the code. And there are some of our service providers that we bring into our facility that are providing services with the intention of those records demonstrating compliance to regulation and to customer specification. Examples may be pathogen testing. In a USDA facility, we have mandatory pathogen testing requirements. That is a regulation. The laboratory that we utilize to be able to perform those services must be accredited to an ISO 17025 standard or equivalent. Sometimes we're required, depending on the product, to demonstrate that we are in compliance with maximum residue limits as it relates to pesticides. We could have contract service providers that are coming in to do validation studies, such as a pasteurizer or on a roasting process, to ensure that our equipment is capable of achieving the pathogen reduction that we are required to demonstrate to ensure that we have a ready-to-eat product. Those contractors would be considered to be high-risk contractors, contract service providers. And they are tied to not only the approval process, approval records, but they are tied to both our food security, food defense, and in many cases, food fraud expectations as well. Next slide. Once a visitor gets in the building, how do we know where they are? Well, factors to consider here is, remember, first of all, contract service providers are all visitors, but not all visitors are contract service providers. So in the case of a crisis, Visitors are going to be escorted. If we have an emergency and we need to make sure that people get out of the building quickly, the management representative that that individual is touring with will take them to the appropriate evacuation route. But what about our contract service providers? They can be in any area of our facility in the event that a crisis occurs. How do we know where they are, and how do we know that they've come out? How do we know that they haven't left already and just forgot to sign out on the visitor log? There are different ways that we handle visitor logs today. Some plants that we go into, we still have a receptionist or an entry point where there's a human that is sitting at a desk, and when you come in, you sign in the visitor log, you sign the GMPs, you provide your identification, and they verify that. And then you wait for your management representative to come up and pick you up. Many facilities, however, due to cost structuring measures, have gone to unmanned visitor entry points, where the visitor or the contractor comes in through a lobby or through a secured vestibule of some kind and logs into a iPad, to a computer-based system or something, and enters their visitor information at that point. These systems have the ability at that point to then notify the responsible individual that, hey, you have a visitor, if you have a contractor that's here. Or sometimes they just come in and there's a phone on the wall with a phone list that says, here, call one of these people. So again, in the event that they are being escorted and they truly are a visitor, managing these things in a crisis is not a big deal. But in the event they're a contract service provider in your facility and a crisis occurs, how do you know who's in there and where they are? AccessWise provides a solution for that. It has the ability to send a text or an email to both the service provider as well as the responsible person within the facility to say, hey, look, are you still here or have you left? And if you've left, you need to sign out. So they can sign out through the app, through the system itself, and we can still manage those records to ensure that, yes, we know who's on site and who's off site. Next slide. Lastly, how do we manage these records? There's a lot of records that are going to come into this. Next slide. The auditor is going to seek evidence of existence of your contract service register and will review some of those specifications and the records that go along with it. I've given just a brief explanation here of what's required both on the raw material side as well as on the contract service side. On the raw material for approved suppliers, at minimum, we have to have a raw material spec, we have to have a letter of guarantee, and we have to have evidence that that supplier that we are purchasing those materials from has HACCP plans or has a HACCP system. This can be demonstrated through a GFSI certificate or other third-party audit that includes a component of HACCP. And if we do require COAs or COCs, that may be also as a part of our mandatory requirements for vendor approval for the material. For contract services, same thing applies. We are going to have a specification, also commonly referred to as a contract. A contract spells out, here's what I'm going to do for you, here's what you're going to pay me. We may require that they provide us with a business license or technician license or certifications as required or applicable by law. And again, this comes back to, I need to know what chemicals you're bringing on site to my location. There can certainly be additional company info required for either of these categories, as most of you are going to have much lengthier requirements. But I simply tried to point out the things that are the expectation, the minimum expectation of the standard. That's a lot of records, folks. Some of these raw material suppliers and high-risk ingredients can have as many as 12 to 20 different documents that are required. COAs, COCs, certificate of origin requirements, Prop 65 statements, allergen statements. We might require product liability insurance. If they're identified as a supply chain preventive control supplier, the list of records that we need gets even longer. So how do you manage all those records? That's a lot of records. Next slide. Well, key factors for successful records management are, number one, that you have a place that records can be centrally located. that we have a repository of some kind and that we have defined the criteria of what records that we need and how we want those records to be stored. These records need to also be easily retrievable and accessible to personnel who need access to them. Many times if these are kept on a server or on a drive that not everyone has access to, then we can't meet that expectation. Things that contribute to records management failure: there are too many chiefs. Too many people are being responsible for records, especially when we start looking at approved supplier records. 20 years ago when I started in the food industry, because I'm really old, I've been around a long time, any approval records that were required for material management were actually generally managed by the quality department because it was a record that was needed for an audit. If we needed an update kosher certificate, quality got it. If you needed a updated specification, it was the requirement of the quality department. Much of that expectation now has shifted as we get farther in preventive controls and we understand that our best bet is to prevent failures before they can occur. Many of that record management has now shifted to procurement or to purchasing agents that may not necessarily understand the content of the record, but they understand the type of records that we're looking for. And so as these records come in, where do they go? Anyone who's managed this process or has been in charge of gathering and maintaining supplier records understands that this is a nightmare. This can be a huge headache. One of the plants that I worked in my early career had 3,000 ingredients. It was a very, very complex facility. We had more than 1,500 suppliers of 3,000 ingredients. That's a lot of records management. So if you get too many chiefs responsible for, this person's responsible for this piece, somebody else is responsible for something else, inevitably your record system is going to fail. So we need to find a way that we can put those into a central location with a gatekeeper to manage those records. Other factors that contribute to that failure is that records expire at different dates. It would be wonderful if everything for my pest control company all expired on the same day, but it doesn't. And then on top of that, my pest control company's records don't expire on the same days that my sanitation company, and they don't expire on the same days that my chemical company, and they don't expire on the same days that my trash company does. So how do we manage this? Today, that's mostly a manual process. It's managed through the use of some type of a database that sends you a notification that these records are nearing expiration, or in more common terms, they're managed through a manual application through an Excel spreadsheet or some other type of manual way of keeping track of expiration dates for hundreds of vendors and thousands of records. Imagine a system that tells you, hey, look, it tells you and it tells your contract service provider, your pest control operator's license expires next week. If we do not have a valid copy and a current license by next week, your service provider will not be able to gain access into our facility. That, to me, is amazing. Imagine how much stress that takes off of your management team, especially your QA managers. A less stressful QA manager is a happy QA manager, and a happy QA manager makes great positive things for the plant. So this is really what we need to look at as far as the process is concerned for how do we bring visitors into our plant. It doesn't start with when they hit our door, sign the log, and come in. Visitor access actually begins way before that with the establishment of our approved supplier programs and what it means to bring a contract service provider in here, establishment of our GMPs, and how do we categorize them, and are we going to train everybody on everything equally, or are we going to break those down and say, okay, this set of criteria is applicable for visitors, this set of criteria is applicable for contract service providers. And then lastly, once we've done the approval and we set the criteria and they do hit that door, how do we manage those records? AccessWise provides that solution for all of those questions. So last slide. Oh, that's me. So the last slide is our contact information. If you have questions related to the content of today's presentation, if you'd like clarification on some of the points that we have talked about, or if you'd like more information about food safety training courses, we offer courses for preventive controls, HACCP, SQF, as well as a very broad curriculum. You're welcome to reach out to either myself or my partner at the email address listed on the screen, or contact us through our website or phone number below. That's it for me. Last slide. So I think we're going to open it up now to questions and answers. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Thank you so much, Christina. Okay, we got a ton of questions in, actually, a lot of really good ones, but I just want to remind everyone of two things. First, we will have a hard stop at 1:30, so if we don't get to your questions, I will be sending that information over to Andrew and Christina so that they can follow up afterwards. And also want to remind everyone that this session has been recorded, and I will post it to the SQFI YouTube channel. It'll probably take me a day or two just to process and edit that and get that up there. But you will be able to revisit this presentation in a couple of days. Okay, so let's start with the first one. I just kind of put these in order kind of as they came through. But the first question is, what is the best way to handle visitors, such as waste removal contractors, who never enter the plant or the facility, and they simply drive in, unload a dumpster, and then leave? They tend to be resistant to the idea of getting out and signing in and out or attending a training.
That's a good question. So remember, first of all, that it's not the driver who's approved. It's the company who's approved. So the waste removal contractor would include your specification or your contract for the service. Here's what you're going to do for me. You're going to pick up my trash, you're going to pick up my waste, and you're going to take it away, and you're going to properly dispose of it. And here's what I'm going to pay for you. But remember, we talked about the fact that these contractors require a risk assessment. In this case, the driver who is simply coming up and emptying your dumpster and driving away never enters your site. They never enter the processing facility. So that would be considered a part of your risk assessment, and this would be a low-risk contractor. If they never enter your site, they never enter your facility, do they need to be trained on GMPs that are applicable once you come into my plant? The answer to that would be no. There's no need for me to provide that training. Now, all of this is completely dependent upon how you write your procedures and how you set the criteria based on a low-risk contractor versus a moderate-risk contractor versus a high-risk contractor.
Okay. Let's see, the next question. I noticed in the slides that it showed entry and exit times. How do you ensure visitors check out and collect badges? I would assume with badges, the visitor has free movement within certain zones without being escorted. Are all visitors restricted to exit through the same set of doors? Or does an employee have to always be vigilant or available when they are exiting?
I'm going to answer part of this, and then I'm going to let Andrew chime in for the rest of it because I don't know the specifics of X-wise. The short answer is yes, visitors and contractors should enter and exit through designated access points. That is more than just our food security requirements. That is about product protection as well. So we don't want somebody going into areas that they are not authorized to access. One of the things that Andrew and his team have been really great about putting together is in the printing of the badge, the company will have the ability to be able to designate by color code what areas that the visitor or the contractor has access to. So it's a visual identification. Beyond that, I think Andrew's going to have to answer the rest of that question.
Thanks, Christina. Yeah, on the badges will be color-coded based on a visitor's category. So, depending if they're maintenance engineering or if they're simply coming to visit on a sales call, their badge will be coded accordingly, and there'll be a visual check that can be done. Entry-exit points, again, there should be designated points. Each of those, with access-wise anyway, there would be a entry and exit machine, so you'd be able to scan in, scan out at those points, and badges would be generated. Obviously, we feel it would be better to limit those as much as possible, where practical. Sorry, Sarah, there was parts of the question I didn't quite hear, and I don't want to miss anything. Can you just run through that one more time?
Sure. Okay. Let's see. It said, are visitors restricted to exit through the same set of doors, or does an employee have to always be vigilant or available when they are exiting?
Okay, so I think that's addressed. So that is really up to you. I think we recommend the fewer the better. It's easier to control. But in terms of our system access-wise, you can have the ability to scan in and scan out at as many entry points as you require.
Okay. Let's see. Next one. Can we have generic approval forms, or do they have to be specific to the nature of the contracting service?
They can absolutely be generic, and you can include a section that says, give me a description of the service, and then the contract service provider at that point would fill out, here's what we're doing for you. You can put a question in there. Think of it about creating a contract service provider questionnaire, a very short one-page document, very similar to what you would have put together as a questionnaire that you would send to a raw material supplier. The questions are just different. So a raw material supplier, we would be asking, do you have a HACCP plan? Do you have a date code explanation? Do you have any CCPs? Do you have any allergens? For a contract service provider, we would be asking, what are you doing for us? Does your service require chemicals? If so, give me a list. Does your service require a license? If so, give me your license. Are you going to subcontract this work out? These are things that we really need to understand, especially if that service has the potential to impact product safety or product quality. So yes, a generic form can be perfectly acceptable. I also noticed a question on here that talked about, do I have to have two separate registers? I'm a small processor. You are required to have a contract service specification register, and you're required to have an approved supplier register. There is nothing in the code that says that they cannot be combined into one document. Remember, part of the presentation that we talked about earlier today, SQF is awesome in the fact that they are not prescriptive in what that format must look like. All the auditor's really after is, do you have the information and can you prove it to me?
So just on that, Christina, that means in terms, of, again, of access-wise and the ability to manage the contract service provider's documents, it can also be used for authorized suppliers in general, in one single database, if you will. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. I think we have time for maybe only one or two more. Let's see. In your experience and according to new types of management in every facility, who is the best person or the best position to handle all records related to contractors? Would it be valid that the quality assurance management team is still in charge?
Ooh, boy, y'all are going to put me on the spot with that question. There's nothing in the code nor the regulations that dictate or mandate who must be responsible. The code simply says you must define the responsibility. In other words, it's up to you as a business. I can tell you as a personal opinion and in my experience, it would be the person best to manage your contract services are going to be the individuals that have the most contract services. So in other words, if you put together a register and you've got 50 contractors and 40 of them report to maintenance and engineering when they come on site, then it would not make sense for the QA manager to manage that. If you do not have a maintenance manager, however, and quality is the authority within the operation that understands how to evaluate risk, how to evaluate the records themselves to determine whether or not they are adequate, legible, and complete, then it may be the quality manager who should be responsible for that. I would say that it is absolutely case-by-case dependent upon your organization.
Okay. Another one that I just saw pop up. Must contracts be written, or can they be oral as needed?
No, they must be written. So, and there are tons of generic samples or templates that you can get off the internet that is a simple couple of statements or sentences. This is the service I'm providing for you. This is what I'm going to pay you. These are the training expectations for those service providers. And again, folks, you have to analyze these services on their own merit. Not every service provider is going to require training. Somebody who's shoveling snow outside doesn't require a formalized training program, but somebody who's calibrating your metering system for chemicals, they need to be trained.
Do you suggest using the same prototype of risk assessment that you would use for monitoring risk for your HACCP plan?
Yes, so we use a food safety risk matrix. That is an amazing tool. We use it for development of our food safety plan. The occurrences or the likelihood stays the same: common occurrence, known to occur, could occur, not expected to occur, or practically impossible. The consequences of failure, however, you can modify that chart to make it fit reasons that fit your operation. The key in using that food safety risk matrix, however, is that if you're going to modify the values, you need to do that at the beginning of your risk assessment. You can't do that halfway through. But you could change that to be consequences may be results in fatality, injury, or illness. That would still be number one concern for food safety. But then it could be, results in failure of a food security protocol, results in product going on hold, results in a customer complaint, or could be insignificant. So an example here would be if I'm looking at a service contractor that is going to be performing a maintenance activity directly above a food contact surface, my consequence here could be, worst case consequence, product goes on hold, because everything that I'm producing underneath that contractor as they're working is now potentially contaminated. Or if it got away from you, the worst consequence, I suppose, could be that you caused harm to the consumer. So yes, the same food safety risk matrix can be utilized for contract services. Just modify the attributes of the values on the failure aspects.
Okay.
Sarah, I know you got a hard stop in 2 minutes. There were a couple of questions on pricing with AccessWise. Just at a high level, real quickly, there's tiered pricing for the contract service provider authorized supplier management component. In terms of actual visits and tracking the visits to the facility, there's no cost for that to the facility. That cost is actually borne by the contract service provider. They pay a per person per year fee. I think, and I'm sure you're going to sum up, but we will get all these questions in context and we can follow up directly.
So, Sarah, can I answer one more question that's on here? Because I joke about this one often, but it actually caused me a problem when I was a QA manager. So there's a question on here that says, what kind of documents are required for snow removal? You wouldn't think this would be a problem. However, let me tell you about a situation that occurred to me. I worked in a very large processing plant with a very large management team, and the logistics manager was responsible for the snow removal contractors. And we had contract sanitation who cleaned our office areas and break room areas, and that contract sanitation person reported to our sanitation manager. So two different managers managing two different contract services. Our snow removal guy put calcium chloride pellets on my sidewalks and in my parking lot for snow melt. My contract sanitation company mopped the floors with an ammonia-based cleaner. When you mix chlorine and ammonia, it causes a very bad employee safety concern. So we think often that contract services, it's somebody plowing my parking lot, how can they possibly create a food safety or a quality or even an employee safety concern for me? They're plowing the parking lot. Well, believe it or not, they can. So you really should look at each of these service providers, the service they provide, what are their actions, and what are they utilizing on your site and on your facility on their own merit.
Okay.
I think that's it.
Well, sorry, everyone. I know there are more questions to be answered, but I will have to send those to Christina and Andrew after, I guess, after today's presentation. But thank you so much, both of you, for presenting. Today was a very popular topic. And once again, I will be editing this recording and posting this up on YouTube, so you will be able to access the recording. And I will contact all of the attendees via an email. But thank you so much again for participating in today's webinar, and we certainly hope that you will join for the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.